December 17, 1945. The war was over. Victory flags hung from windows across America, and soldiers were coming home to ticker tape parades and the warm embrace of families who'd waited years for their return. But in a remote valley deep within the Austrian Alps, 5 Army medics were about to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt military investigators for 7 decades. Their names were etched in military records. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the team leader who'd saved countless lives across 3 theaters of war. Corporal James Patterson, barely 20 years old, but with hands steadier than surgeons twice his age. Private First Class Robert Chen, the quiet one who spoke fluent German and served as their translator. Sergeant William Hayes, a former medical student from Chicago who'd abandoned his degree to serve his country. And Private Tommy Sullivan, the youngest of the group at just 19, whose letters home spoke of nothing but returning to his sweetheart in Boston. They were part of the 47th Medical Battalion, tasked with establishing temporary field hospitals in newly liberated territories. Their mission was supposed to be routine: set up a medical station in a small Austrian village, treat any remaining wounded civilians, and document German medical equipment left behind by retreating forces. Simple, safe, almost mundane compared to the hell they'd survived during the actual fighting. But sometimes the most ordinary missions become the most extraordinary mysteries. On December 15th, the 5 medics had loaded their supplies into a military transport truck and departed from their base camp near Salzburg. Radio contact was established at 0800 hours, 1200 hours, and again at 1600 hours. Everything was proceeding according to plan. They'd reached the village of St. Georgen, a tiny settlement nestled in a valley so remote it barely appeared on military maps. The locals were cooperative, grateful even. The medics set up their field hospital in an abandoned school building and began treating minor injuries and illnesses that had gone untreated during the final months of the war. Their final radio transmission came at 1800 hours on December the 16th. Sergeant Torres reported that they'd completed their medical assessments and would be documenting German equipment the following morning before returning to base. His voice was calm, professional, giving no indication of trouble. The transmission ended with the standard military sign-off. Everything was normal. 24 hours later, silence. When the medics failed to check in on December 17th, their commanding officer, Colonel Harrison Webb, initially assumed radio equipment failure. Mountain valleys were notorious for disrupting communications, and the harsh alpine winter could damage even the most reliable gear. But when a second day passed without contact, Webb dispatched a search team to St. Georgen. What they found defied explanation. The village was empty. Not just the medics, but every single civilian had vanished. Houses stood with doors ajar, meals half-eaten on kitchen tables, fires still smoldering in fireplaces. The scene looked like everyone had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. But most disturbing of all was the school building where the medics had established their field hospital. Their equipment was gone, not destroyed, not scattered by some violent struggle, just gone. Medical supplies, surgical instruments, radio equipment, personal belongings, even their military truck had disappeared without a trace. The only evidence they'd ever been there was a single dog tag wedged between floorboards belonging to Private Sullivan. The initial investigation was swift but fruitless. Military police scoured the surrounding mountains, interviewed residents in neighboring villages, and followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. Some locals reported seeing unusual lights in the mountains the night of December 16th. Others claimed to have heard vehicle engines echoing through the valley long after midnight. But no physical evidence supported these accounts, and the harsh winter weather had already begun erasing any tracks or traces. Colonel Webb refused to accept that 5 experienced soldiers and an entire village could simply evaporate. He expanded the search, bringing in specialized alpine rescue teams and even consulting with local mountain guides who knew every cave and hidden path in the region. For 3 weeks, teams searched through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, finding nothing but empty wilderness. By January 1946, the official investigation was suspended. The 5 medics were classified as missing in action, their families notified, and their names added to the growing list of soldiers whose fates remained unknown in the chaotic aftermath of war. The incident was filed away, marked, classified, and gradually forgotten as the world moved on to rebuilding from the devastation. But some mysteries refused to stay buried, especially when they involved people who dedicated their lives to saving others. The years passed. The families of the missing medics never stopped searching for answers. Private Sullivan's sweetheart, Margaret O'Brien, spent her life savings hiring private investigators and traveling to Austria multiple times, following every rumor and chasing every lead. Staff Sergeant Torres's younger brother, Carlos, became a journalist specifically to use his research skills in searching for clues about what happened that December night. The families wrote letters to senators, contacted veterans organizations, and even reached out to former German officers who might have knowledge of the area. Decades rolled by. The Korean War came and went. Vietnam divided the nation. The Cold War created new tensions and new mysteries. The 5 medics from St. Georgen became a footnote in military history, remembered only by their families and a small group of military historians fascinated by unsolved cases from World War II. In 1975, 30 years after the disappearance, Carlos Torres published a book titled The Lost Battalion. It wasn't entirely accurate, since only 5 men had vanished, but the title captured the public imagination. The book detailed his 3 decades of research, every interview conducted, every document uncovered, every theory explored. It became a minor bestseller among military history enthusiasts and spawned several documentary attempts, though none ever materialized due to lack of concrete evidence. The book did accomplish one important thing. It kept the story alive for a new generation of researchers and amateur investigators. Online forums dedicated to military mysteries began discussing the case in the early days, plausible to the absurd. Some suggested the medics have of the Internet. Theories ranged from they'd been captured by Nazi holdouts still hiding in the mountains. Others proposed they'd stumbled upon a secret weapons cache and been eliminated to protect classified information. More exotic theories involved everything from Soviet special operations to supernatural phenomena in the Austrian Alps. But theories without evidence remain just theories, and the decades continued to pass without answers. By 2010, only 2 family members from the original search were still alive. Margaret O'Brien, now in her 80s and living in a nursing home in Boston, still kept a photo of Tommy Sullivan on her nightstand. Carlos Torres, despite being diagnosed with early-stage dementia, continued updating his research files with new information gleaned from declassified documents and Internet searches his grandchildren helped him conduct. The story might have ended there, fading into obscurity, as the last witnesses passed away and the world forgot about 5 young medics who'd served their country faithfully only to vanish into the alpine wilderness. Military historians occasionally referenced the case in broader studies of missing personnel from World War II, but no active investigation had been conducted in over 40 years. That changed on September 23, 2015, when a group of Austrian hikers made a discovery that would resurrect one of the military's most baffling cold cases and reveal a truth more shocking than anyone had imagined. The hikers were members of the Salzburg Alpine Club, experienced mountaineers exploring a remote section of the Teningerberg mountain range. They were following an old hunting trail that local maps indicated led to a series of limestone caves popular with spelunkers. The trail was difficult, requiring technical climbing gear and intimate knowledge of the terrain. It was exactly the kind of place that casual searchers in 1945 would never have thought to explore. Klaus Brenner, the group's leader, noticed something unusual about the rock formations near what appeared to be the entrance to a large cave system. The stones looked deliberately arranged, almost like a camouflaged entrance. His curiosity piqued. Brenner used climbing equipment to investigate what he initially assumed was a natural cave opening. What he found inside would change everything. The cave wasn't natural. It was a carefully constructed underground facility carved into the mountainside with precision that suggested military engineering. More shocking still, it appeared to be completely preserved, as if frozen in time for 70 years. Emergency lighting systems still functioned. Medical equipment sat exactly where it had been left. And scattered throughout the facility were personal belongings, military gear, and documentation that would finally answer the questions that had haunted investigators for 7 decades. This wasn't just any hidden facility. According to the documents Brenner discovered, this was Field Hospital Bravo 7, established by the 47th Medical Battalion in December 1945. The same unit that had vanished without a trace from the village of St. Georgen. But how had a fully operational field hospital ended up hidden inside a mountain cave? Why was it so perfectly preserved? And most importantly, what had happened to the 5 medics who'd built it? The answers lay scattered throughout the underground facility like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Brenner and his team documented everything with their cameras before contacting Austrian authorities. But what they captured in the final days of World War II in the Austrian Alps would challenge everything historians thought they knew. The facility was massive, extending deep into the mountain through a series of interconnected chambers. The main medical bay contained surgical equipment that looked barely used, medicines still sealed in their original packaging, and examination tables positioned as if patients might arrive at any moment. But it was the personal quarters that told the real story. 5 sleeping areas, each marked with familiar names: Torres, Patterson Chen, Hayes Sullivan. Their belongings were arranged with military precision. Uniforms hung from makeshift hooks. Personal letters sat in neat stacks. A chess game remained frozen mid-play between Patterson and Chen. Sullivan's diary lay open to an entry dated December 18, 1945, 2 days after their final radio transmission. Austrian authorities contacted military historians immediately. Within 48 hours, American military personnel were on site, followed by representatives from the Department of Defense and specialists in World War II documentation. The discovery was classified as sensitive, not because of national security concerns, but because of the profound implications for families who'd spent 70 years wondering about their loved one's fate. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a military historian from the War College, led the American investigation team. Her first priority was establishing a timeline of events. The evidence painted a picture vastly different from what investigators had assumed in 1945. The medics hadn't vanished from St. Georgen. They'd never intended to return to base camp. According to documents found in the facility, they'd received new orders on December 16th, classified orders that required them to establish a covert medical station in the mountains. But these orders hadn't come through normal military channels. They bore the signatures of officers who, according to military records, had been killed in action months earlier. Someone had deliberately lured the 5 medics away from their routine mission and into the mountains. But who and why? The answer began to emerge as investigators translated German documents scattered throughout the facility. These weren't standard military communications. They were correspondence between Nazi officers who'd remained in the region after Germany's surrender, planning what they called Operation Resurrection, a desperate attempt to regroup surviving German forces for a final offensive. The plan was audacious and terrifying in its scope. Using hidden weapons caches and secret facilities throughout the Alps, Remaining Nazi forces intended to launch coordinated attacks on Allied positions, while negotiations for post-war Europe were still ongoing. They needed medical support for their wounded fighters, but traditional German medical personnel had either surrendered or fled. American medics, however, were still actively treating casualties and had access to superior medical supplies. The forged orders were part of an elaborate deception. German intelligence operatives posing as American officers had convinced the 5 medics that they were needed for a classified mission to treat high-value prisoners of war. The medics, trained to follow orders without question, had unknowingly walked into a trap. But the story took an even darker turn when investigators discovered Sullivan's complete diary. His final entries revealed that the medics had quickly realized their situation. The prisoners they were supposed to treat were actually German soldiers preparing for combat operations. The Americans they thought had given them orders were revealed to be enemy agents. By December 18th, the 5 medics understood they'd been deceived and were now prisoners themselves. What happened next would demonstrate both the horror of their situation and the extraordinary courage that defined their generation. Rather than passively accept their fate, the medics began planning their own operation. Chen, with his fluency in German, had been gathering intelligence about Operation Resurrection by pretending to cooperate with their captors. Hayes used his medical knowledge to slowly poison the water supply feeding the German positions, causing widespread illness among enemy forces. Torres organized the others into shifts, systematically sabotaging equipment and communications while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Their plan was working. German forces throughout the region began falling ill. Communications between Nazi positions broke down. Weapons malfunctioned at crucial moments. The 5 American medics, using nothing but medical supplies and their own ingenuity, were single-handedly destroying Operation Resurrection from within. But their captors weren't fools. By December 22nd, German officers had realized what was happening. Sullivan's diary entries became increasingly frantic as he described heated arguments between Nazi commanders about how to handle their American prisoners. Some wanted to execute them immediately. Others argued they were too valuable as medical personnel. The debate raged for days while the medics continued their sabotage operations. The final diary entry, dated December 28th, was brief but chilling. They know. Torres says we fight. Hayes says we run. Chen says we hide. Patterson says we pray. I say we do all 4. If anyone finds this, tell Margaret I kept my promise to come home. I'm coming home. That was the last written record of the 5 medics, but their story wasn't over. Hidden in a sealed container behind the main surgical station, investigators found something that would finally reveal the complete truth about what happened in those mountains 70 years ago. It was a detailed report, written in Torres's careful handwriting, documenting everything they'd learned about Operation Resurrection. Names of German officers, locations of weapons caches, planned attack dates, communication codes, supply routes, and, most importantly, the complete organizational structure of Nazi forces still operating in the Austrian Alps. The report was addressed to Allied Command and dated January 15, 1946. Somehow, despite being prisoners in an underground facility, the medics had continued gathering intelligence for nearly a month after their capture. More incredibly, they'd found a way to compile this information into a comprehensive battle plan that would have allowed Allied forces to completely destroy the remaining Nazi resistance. But the report had never been delivered. Why? The answer lay in the facility's final chamber, a section that Brenner's team had initially overlooked because it was sealed behind what appeared to be a collapsed tunnel. When investigators finally broke through, they discovered something that would forever change how the world remembered the 5 missing medics. The chamber was a workshop. Inside, the Americans had been manufacturing explosives using medical supplies and materials scavenged from throughout the facility. Iodine, Alcohol, surgical tubing, metal fragments, everything had been repurposed into an arsenal that would have impressed professional saboteurs. Plans drawn on medical charts showed attack routes through the mountain facility. Timing schedules indicated they'd been planning a coordinated assault on their captors. But most revealing of all was a message carved into the stone wall in Torres's distinctive handwriting. "If we don't make it out, remember that we chose to fight." January 20th, 1946, Operation Hippocrates. January 20th, 1946. Exactly 79 years before Brenner discovered the facility, the medics had planned their own operation, naming it after the ancient Greek physician whose oath guided their profession. They'd spent over a month gathering intelligence, planning attacks, and preparing to destroy Operation Resurrection from within. The evidence suggested they'd succeeded, at least partially. German documents found throughout the Alps confirmed that Operation Resurrection had collapsed in late January 1946, not due to Allied military action, but because of systematic sabotage that had crippled Nazi forces from within. Communications had failed, supply lines had been severed, and key personnel had been eliminated through what German reports described as medical complications. 5 American medics, using only their medical training and incredible courage, had prevented what could have been a devastating final offensive that might have prolonged the war for months or even years. But what had become of them? Had they escaped after completing their mission? Had they died in their final assault? Had they been executed by their captors? The mountain facility held one more secret, one that would finally provide the closure that families had sought for 7 decades. In the deepest section of the facility, behind a chamber that had been deliberately sealed with medical equipment and surgical instruments welded together to form an impenetrable barrier, investigators made their final discovery. The seal wasn't random. It had been crafted with precision, using techniques that only someone with extensive medical knowledge could have devised. The metalwork was crude but effective, clearly created under extreme circumstances with limited tools. When cutting torches finally breached the barrier, investigators found themselves in what could only be described as a tomb, but not the kind they'd expected. The chamber contained 5 stone cairns, carefully constructed memorial markers arranged in a perfect military formation. Each cairn bore a makeshift cross fashioned from surgical instruments. Beneath each cross, a name had been etched with medical precision: Torres, Patterson Chen, Hayes Sullivan. But these weren't graves. They were memorials built by the living to honor the dead. Because scattered throughout the chamber were German uniforms, weapons, and personal effects. Dozens of them. The evidence painted a clear picture of what had transpired in January 1946. The 5 medics hadn't just sabotaged Operation Resurrection. They'd fought their way through the entire Nazi facility, eliminating every enemy combatant they encountered. Dr. Mitchell's team found German after-action reports hidden in a waterproof container, apparently preserved by one of the Nazi officers before his death. The documents described a coordinated assault that began at 0300 hours on January 20th, 1946. The Americans had used their month of captivity to map every tunnel, every guard position, every weakness in the facility's defenses. The attack was surgical in its precision. Chen had poisoned the night watch, causing them to fall unconscious at their posts. Hayes had sabotaged the facility's electrical systems, plunging the Germans into darkness. Patterson had sealed exit tunnels, trapping enemy forces inside. Sullivan had destroyed communications equipment, preventing calls for reinforcement. And Torres had led the final assault, moving through the darkened facility with methodical efficiency. The German reports described the Americans as ghosts in the darkness, appearing and disappearing through tunnels they'd memorized during weeks of captivity. The Nazi forces, weakened by months of illness and sabotage, were no match for 5 men who'd spent 36 days planning their revenge. But victory had come at a cost. Hidden beneath Torres's cairn, investigators found his final report, written in the hours after their successful assault. His handwriting was shaky, clearly written under extreme duress. The report detailed their complete success in destroying Operation Resurrection, but also revealed the price they'd paid. Patterson had been shot during the initial assault, but had continued fighting until the facility was secured. Chen had been injured in a tunnel collapse he'd deliberately triggered to seal off German reinforcements. Hayes had suffered severe burns while destroying the enemy's chemical weapons stockpile. Sullivan had been wounded by shrapnel from his own explosives, but had refused medical attention until their mission was complete. And Torres himself had been hit by enemy fire during the final room-to-room clearing operations. According to his report, all 5 medics were wounded but alive when the fighting ended. They'd accomplished their mission completely. Operation Resurrection was destroyed, its leaders dead, its plans in ruins. The Nazi threat in the Austrian Alps had been eliminated by 5 American medics using nothing but medical supplies, captured equipment, and extraordinary courage. But they were trapped. The explosions and tunnel collapses that had sealed off German escape routes had also blocked their own path to freedom. The facility's ventilation systems had been damaged in the fighting. Their radio equipment had been destroyed during the assault. They were alone in a mountain tomb of their own making, slowly running out of air and medical supplies to treat their wounds. Torres's final entries became increasingly desperate as the reality of their situation became clear. They'd won their battle, but lost their war. The 5 medics who dedicated their lives to saving others were now dying slowly in the darkness, with no one to save them. January 25, 1946. Torres wrote his last coherent entry. "We did what we came to do. Operation Resurrection is finished. No more Nazis in these mountains. No more threats to Allied positions. We stopped them. But we can't stop what's happening to us. Patterson died this morning, blood loss. Chen went yesterday, lung damage from the cave-in. Hayes is unconscious, burns too severe. Sullivan is trying to stay strong for me, but I can see him fading. I'm fading too." The entry continued, becoming, if anyone finds this, tell hour less legible, as Torres's condition deteriorated. "Families, we didn't die as prisoners. We died as soldiers. We died completing our mission. We died free. Tell Margaret that Sullivan kept his promise. He came home. We all came home, just not the way we planned." The final lines were barely readable, scratched into the paper with what must have been Torres's last conscious effort. "Buried the others with honor. Military formation. Facing east toward home. When my time comes, Sullivan will do the same for me. We take care of our own, always. 47th Medical Battalion, mission accomplished." That was the end. 5 young men who'd survived the hell of World War II, who'd dedicated their lives to healing others, who'd single-handedly prevented a final Nazi offensive that could have prolonged the war, had died alone in a mountain cave, forgotten by history. But they hadn't been forgotten by each other. The final evidence investigators found was the most heartbreaking of all. Sullivan's body was positioned near the sealed entrance to the memorial chamber, his hands still wrapped around the makeshift tools he'd used to build Torres's cairn. Even in his final moments, dying from his wounds in the darkness, he'd fulfilled his promise to give his team leader a proper burial. The investigation team worked in complete silence as they documented the scene. These weren't just historical artifacts they were cataloging. These were the final moments of 5 heroes whose sacrifice had been forgotten by the world for 70 years. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary report, classified but later released to family members, concluded that the 5 medics had prevented what intelligence experts estimated could have been a devastating series of coordinated attacks on Allied positions throughout Central Europe. Operation Resurrection had involved over 200 German soldiers, multiple weapons caches, and plans to target key diplomatic negotiations that were shaping post-war Europe. By eliminating this threat, Torres and his team had potentially saved hundreds of Allied lives and prevented months of additional conflict in an already war-torn region. Their intelligence gathering had also provided complete documentation of remaining Nazi networks throughout the Alps, information that proved invaluable to Allied forces conducting final cleanup operations in the region. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated something that military historians had long debated about the greatest generation. When faced with impossible odds, when abandoned behind enemy lines, when forgotten by their own command structure, these 5 young medics had refused to accept defeat. They'd turned their medical training into a weapon, their healing hands into instruments of war, their oath to preserve life into a mission, to eliminate those who threatened innocent people. The facility contained one final mystery that investigators are still working to solve. Hidden throughout the medical equipment were dozens of small modifications, improvements to surgical instruments and medical procedures that were decades ahead of their time. The medics had apparently spent their month in captivity not just planning their assault, but advancing medical science. Some of the techniques they'd developed wouldn't be officially discovered by medical researchers until the 1960s and 1970s. Their innovations in trauma surgery, field sterilization, and emergency medicine were revolutionary. Even while planning their final battle, they'd continued their mission as healers, developing new ways to save lives. Military medical experts who studied their work described it as genius-level innovation, born from desperation and dedication. These 5 young men had essentially created a complete field hospital using nothing but captured German supplies and their own ingenuity. They'd developed new surgical procedures, created medicines from basic chemicals, and established treatment protocols that would have impressed doctors at major hospitals. The discovery of Field Hospital Bravo 7 sent shockwaves through both military and medical communities. Here was proof that the missing medics hadn't just vanished or died accidentally. They'd fought one of the most remarkable battles in military history, achieved complete victory against overwhelming odds, and advanced medical science in the process. But the discovery also raised disturbing questions about military record-keeping and the treatment of missing personnel. How had 5 highly trained medics been sent on a mission with forged orders without anyone noticing? How had their disappearance been investigated so poorly that a massive underground facility went undiscovered for 70 years? How many other missing soldiers from World War II might have similar stories that were never properly investigated? The Department of Defense launched an internal review of missing personnel cases from the war, focusing specifically on incidents that had been closed prematurely or investigated inadequately. The Torres case became a model for how such investigations should be conducted, with teams of military historians, forensic specialists, and local researchers working together to uncover the truth. More importantly, the discovery provided closure for the families who'd never stopped searching for answers. Margaret O'Brien, now 89 years old and in failing health, was flown to Austria to visit the site where Tommy Sullivan had died. She spent hours in the memorial chamber, reading his diary entries and touching the cairn he'd built with his own hands. Carlos Torres, despite his advancing dementia, retained enough clarity to understand that his brother had died a hero. The family held a proper military funeral with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The 5 medics were finally coming home. The Austrian government declared the facility a protected historical site, with plans to create a memorial honoring both the American medics and the victims of Operation Resurrection. The story of Field Hospital Bravo 7 became required reading at military medical schools, and the innovations the medics developed were incorporated into modern field medicine training. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the decision by the current 47th Medical Battalion to adopt the motto that investigators found carved above the facility's main entrance. In Torres's careful handwriting, the words read simply, "We heal, we fight, we remember." Those words now appear on every piece of equipment used by the battalion's medics, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of healing require the courage to fight for what's right. The investigation of Field Hospital Bravo 7 was officially closed in 2016, but the story continues to reveal new details as researchers analyze the thousands of documents, photographs, and artifacts recovered from the site. Each piece of evidence adds another layer to our understanding of what happened in those mountains during the winter of 1946. What emerges is a picture of 5 ordinary young men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and chose to become heroes. They could have accepted their fate as prisoners. They could have simply tried to escape. Instead, they chose to fight, not just for their own freedom, but for the safety of countless others who would never know their names. Their story reminds us that the greatest acts of courage often happen in darkness, witnessed by no one, recorded by no official historian. Sometimes heroes die alone, forgotten by the world they saved. But eventually, if we're lucky, the truth finds a way to surface. 70 years after 5 Army medics disappeared in the Austrian Alps, their field hospital stands as a testament to the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when guided by duty, courage, and an unshakable commitment to protecting others. The discovery sent ripples through military communities worldwide, but it also opened doors to questions no one had anticipated. As researchers continued analyzing the facility, they uncovered evidence that suggested the story was even more complex than initially believed. Hidden in a false bottom of Torres's medical kit, investigators found correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of the weeks leading up to their capture. The letters weren't addressed to family members or fellow soldiers. They were intelligence reports written in code, documenting suspicious activities they'd observed during their routine missions throughout Austria in late 1945. The medics had been gathering information about unusual German activity for weeks before their disappearance. They'd noticed supply movements in remote mountain areas, civilian populations evacuating from specific regions, and, most concerning of all, American officers giving orders that didn't align with standard military protocol. Torres had been quietly documenting these irregularities, apparently suspecting that something larger was happening beneath the surface of routine post-war operations. Dr. Mitchell's team brought in cryptography specialists to decode the reports. What they revealed was chilling. The 5 medics had stumbled upon the early stages of Operation Resurrection weeks before they were lured to St. Georgen. They'd identified key Nazi personnel, tracked supply routes, and even discovered the locations of several weapons caches. Their routine medical missions had inadvertently made them the most knowledgeable Allied personnel about remaining German resistance in the entire Austrian theater. This revelation transformed the entire narrative. The medics hadn't been random victims of an elaborate deception. They'd been specifically targeted because they knew too much. The forged orders weren't just meant to capture 5 American medical personnel for German use. They were designed to eliminate 5 soldiers who possessed intelligence that could destroy Operation Resurrection before it even began. The German documents found throughout the facility confirmed this theory. Nazi commanders had been aware of American surveillance activities and had identified the 5 medics as their primary security threat. The plan to capture them had been developed over several weeks, with German agents carefully studying their routines, their personalities, and their likely responses to different scenarios. But the Germans had made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that capturing the medics would eliminate the threat to their operation. Instead, they'd given their enemies direct access to their most secure facility, complete intelligence about their plans, and over a month to develop countermeasures. The very people they'd tried to silence had become their most effective opponents. Evidence scattered throughout the facility revealed just how thoroughly the Americans had infiltrated German operations during their captivity. Chen had used his language skills to intercept and decode communications between Nazi positions. Hayes had analyzed captured medical supplies to determine the size and health status of German forces. Patterson had mapped the entire mountain tunnel system, identifying vulnerabilities and escape routes. Sullivan had documented guard rotations and security procedures with mathematical precision, and Torres had coordinated everything, turning their forced imprisonment into the most successful intelligence operation of the post-war period. The scope of their achievement became clear as investigators analyzed German casualty reports from January 1946. The systematic poisoning Hayes had conducted hadn't just made enemy soldiers sick. It had created a cascade of medical emergencies that overwhelmed German medical facilities throughout the region. Commanders had been forced to evacuate wounded personnel to field hospitals that Patterson had already identified and targeted for sabotage. Meanwhile, Chen's communication intercepts had allowed the Americans to feed false information back to German command structures, creating confusion and mistrust among Nazi officers. Units had been sent on missions based on corrupted intelligence. Supply convoys had been rerouted to locations where Allied forces were waiting. The entire German network had been systematically dismantled from within by 5 men using nothing but medical equipment and extraordinary ingenuity. The final assault on January 20th hadn't been a desperate last stand. It had been the culmination of a month-long campaign that had already destroyed Operation Resurrection's effectiveness. The physical elimination of remaining German personnel was simply the final step in a comprehensive victory that had been weeks in the making. But new evidence suggested the story was still incomplete. Hidden in the facility's deepest chambers, investigators found references to other American personnel who might have been involved in similar operations. Code names appeared throughout German documents: Alpine Fox, Mountain Eagle, Snow Wolf, Winter Ghost, Ghost Medic. References to American units that official records claimed had never existed. Today, Field Hospital Bravo 7 serves as more than just a memorial to 5 forgotten heroes. It stands as proof that courage doesn't always wear medals, that the most important battles are sometimes fought in silence, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender their principles. Torres, Patterson, Chen, Hayes, and Sullivan didn't just save lives during their final mission, they saved the future, preventing a catastrophe that could have changed the course of history. Their story reminds us that heroes aren't born from glory, they're forged in darkness, and sometimes the greatest victories are the ones the world never gets to see.